Funny atheists are so stupid, okay? Now you sit here, okay, and watch as I lay the smackdown on that stupid funny atheist #1 son.
Or I'll swallow your soul.
Okay? Okay.
Hey, wait a minute. I don't believe the Bible teaches anti-Semitism. I think later church authors like Tertullian interpreted this passage that way.
Yeah, sure, and that's why you first put it this way, right?
But then God came to earth and was born a Jew. Things were looking up. But that rosy forecast got shot all to hell thanks to Matthew's gospel, when he claimed the Jewish mob said, "Hey, blame Jesus' death on us and all our children." With the stroke of a pen, the entire Jewish race became Christ killers.
So yeah, no mention of Justin, no mention of Tertullian, and it was Matthew 27:25 that interrupted that rosy forecast. So sure, you didn't think the Bible taught anti-Semitism, ya big phony.
Okay, in retrospect, I can see how Holding might watch my blame game video and conclude that I was accusing Matthew of anti-Semitism. So, overall, I think it was a fair criticism.
That just happened.
Yeah, man.
So you think the crowd is saying they're so confident of their innocence that they're saying, let Jesus' blood be on us and our children if we're lying, right?
Yeah, took you only a year to get it.
In another video, Holding admitted to being purposefully vague about the source for his profession of innocence idea, and he did this in order to trap unsuspecting fundy atheists into accusing him of poor scholarship. Yeah, that's the kind of person we're dealing with here. Anyway, Holding revealed his source to be Jesus on Trial by Dr. Gerard S. Sloyan, a well-known biblical scholar with extensive credentials. JP's online trial article confirmed this as well. So let's take a look at Sloyan's thesis concerning Matthew 27:25 and see what grade it actually deserves.
The phrase, "His blood be on us and on our children," is biblical and is not an acceptance of guilt for Jesus' death, rather a claim of innocence to match Pilate's.
Sure, it was not an acceptance of guilt in the sense that the people in verse 25 were not accepting guilt for a man they knew was innocent. However, I do think they were accepting responsibility for someone they believed was guilty of blasphemy. Richard France and Helen Bond both recognize Matthew 27:25 as an ancient Israelite formula of responsibility. Todd Baker described the phrase as an idiom expressing individual or group responsibility that traces its use and meaning from the Old Testament. And the verse's connection to this principle is shared by every other writer I have read on the subject. Now, other biblical scholars like Gregory Baum and Holding's friend Craig Blomberg share Sloyan's view that Matthew 27:25 was an expression of innocence, but at the same time, they maintain it expressed responsibility as well. So in the end, although these scholars may not see the verse as mutually exclusive, the common thread connecting them together is this concept of responsibility.
See the use made of it in Jeremiah 26:15 and 51:35, and the phrase attributed to Paul, "Your blood be upon your own heads. I am not to blame."
What the various blood passages in the Bible consistently show is this. If a person professed innocence, they did so by placing the blood on someone else. Whoever bore the blood bore the responsibility. Acts 18:6 is a great example of this. Paul declared his innocence by shaking the dust off his garments and saying the Jews' blood was on their own heads, not his. In Joshua 2:19, the Hebrew spies told Rahab that if her family left her house during the sacking of Jericho, their blood would be on their own heads. The Hebrews would not be responsible. But if the Hebrews broke into Rahab's house, then the family's blood would be upon the Hebrews. The Hebrews would be responsible. If an Israelite cursed his mother or father, he was to be put to death. His blood would be upon him. If he slept with his mother-in-law, same outcome. Their blood would be upon them. Man with sister-in-law, man with man with animal, dead, dead, and dead. all of those people would bear the responsibility for their own blood. Even poor Mr. Ed. When Pilate declared his innocence, he did so by symbolically washing the blood of Jesus off of himself. And then he told the Jews, "See to it yourselves." So if the people in Matthew 27:25 really wanted to make a claim of innocence to match Pilate's, then they would have said, "Let Jesus' blood be on your head, not ours." Oh, and by the way, Jeremiah 26:15 says that if the angry mob had killed God's prophet, they would have brought the guilt of innocent blood on themselves and the city and all those who lived in it. Now, imagine if they had killed God's son.
Its meaning is, if we had anything to do with it, let our descendants share our guilt, but we do not.
But of course, they did have something to do with Jesus' death. The whole people in Matthew 27:25 shared responsibility for it. In Acts 4:27, Peter and John declared that Herod, Pilate, the Gentiles, and the people of Israel in Jerusalem conspired together against Jesus. This is what makes the whole argument so pointless. Whether the people thought they were innocent or not, the Gospels and the book of Acts clearly taught they bore responsibility. And according to Matthew, their descendants would end up sharing their father's guilt when the Romans sacked Jerusalem 40 years later, within that generation.
It appears in later mishnaic form in the Talmudic tractate Sanhedrin 37a, where, in capital cases, the witness uses the invocation as a proof of his innocence.
The problem is, Dr. Sloyan makes this claim without supplying the reader with any sources to support it. There are no endnotes in the book pointing to examples of any Jewish witness using the phrase as a proof or oath of innocence. The Mishnah in question does not even present the blood responsibility passage as a witness invocation. I've checked the translations of Rabbi Samuel Mendelssohn and Dr. Jacob Neusner, and their versions are largely the same as the one Holding and I have seen online. The blood passage was clearly used by the judges to admonish witnesses in capital cases. Now, of course, just because one particular tractate fails to mention a witness invocation doesn't necessarily prove that one was not used. However, in his work on ancient Jewish law, Rabbi Mendelssohn recognized that neither the Bible nor the Talmud imposes on the witness any oath to confirm his testimony. The divine prohibition of bearing false witness was considered sufficient to induce people to state truths only. He also pointed out how Deuteronomy 19 already regulated the punishment for false witnesses. Do to the false witness as that witness intended to do to the other party. Show no pity. Life for life, eye for eye, etc. However, Mendelssohn clarified that the rabbis did suggest having judges supply witnesses with a preliminary warning, and no surprise, it's the warning presented in Tractate Sanhedrin 37. One of Holding's sources, Walter Chandler, supported the sufficiency of the Ninth Commandment to safeguard against perjury, and he informed his readers that Jewish philosophers like Philo of Alexandria held that if a person swore against falsehood, they would necessarily come under suspicion of being untrustworthy. Philo, of course, lived during the lifetime of Jesus, so this principle was held at some point during that era. I also contacted several Talmudic scholars, asking them if they had ever heard of a witness invocation derived from Sanhedrin 37a. Dr. Jeffrey Rubenstein, professor of Talmud and Rabbinics at New York University, said, "I don't believe there is any such oath in rabbinic law or in the Talmud. The witnesses don't even take an oath themselves as far as I recall. They are kind of warned about how serious their testimony is." He then referred me to a Jewish Virtual Library article that mirrored Rabbi Mendelssohn. In principle, Jewish law does not exact an oath from a witness with respect to the truthfulness of his testimony, since perjury was one of the prohibitions in the Ten Commandments, and therefore every witness is sworn since Mount Sinai to testify only truthfully. Originally, Jewish law required only that witnesses be warned before testifying of their obligation to testify truthfully, of the strict prohibition on perjury, and of the punishment prescribed for perjury without actually swearing them in. However, in the 15th century, that began to change. Dr. Richard Kalman, professor of Talmud and Rabbinics at the Jewish Theological Seminary, said, "I don't know of anything like a witness's oath in the Talmud, although it's possible something like that developed post-Talmudically. I have no reason to think it did, however. The fact that witnesses were the ones who executed the criminal was viewed as sufficient to guard against lying witnesses." So, if Dr. Sloyan failed to provide an example of a witness invocation in his book, if the Mishnah in question does not mention one, if neither the Bible nor the Talmud imposed an oath on witnesses to confirm their testimony, if Jewish law did not introduce the idea until the 15th century, and if Talmudic scholars like Rubinstein and Kalman have never heard of such an oath, then at this point, Dr. Sloyan's claim about a mishnaic proof of innocence is clearly unsupported. The fact is, Tractate Sanhedrin 37a is a judicial warning of responsibility. If the mob's cry in Matthew 27:25 really did find its source in Hebrew scripture or law, then the phrase was used to acknowledge responsibility for the blood of Jesus.
If he is lying, he is willing to have the blood of the accused fall on himself and his offspring until the end of the world.
Okay, first of all, the Mishnah does not limit false testimony simply to lying. The parameters were a bit wider than that. For example, if a witness's testimony was based only on conjecture, or on hearsay, or if the evidence came from the mouth of another witness, even if that witness was a trustworthy person, if an innocent soul was put to death based on that kind of testimony, the witness would be held responsible for the blood of the accused. The footnote for 37b clarifies that such a perversion of justice could be completely unintentional on the witness's part, but they would still bear the moral responsibility, which is why witnesses might question if it was worth testifying in the first place. This is compounded by the fact that, as Kalman mentioned earlier, the witnesses in capital cases were given the task of performing the execution. This ensured that the convicted person's blood could, quite literally, fall upon the witnesses, depending on the mode of punishment. Secondly, Sloyan claims the blood fell upon the witness's offspring until the end of the world. But again, that's not what Sanhedrin 37a says. He has it backwards. The Mishnah refers to the potential descendants of the accused, not the witness. Dr. Neusner's amplified translation of the passage puts it this way. In capital cases, the accused's blood and the blood of all those who were destined to be born from him, who was wrongfully convicted, are held against him who testifies falsely to the end of time. And in his chapter on maxims and rules, Mendelssohn explained, the blood of the victim of false testimony and that of his lost progeny falls upon the heads of the witnesses. So thankfully, this leads us to believe the witnesses' descendants are not in the line of fire. However, in the case of Matthew 27:25, the mob's children were clearly in the crosshairs. So if we were grading Sloyan's thesis in isolation, I'd have to say this claim lacks sources, this line should be brought in to simply say false testimony, and this line should refer to the accused's children, not the witnesses. Oh, and one last point on this subject. It's important to note that Sloyan's interpretation of Matthew 27:25 is underpinned by his belief that the passage itself is not historical. Rather, he holds it to be unquestionably typological. On page 66, he remarks that his blood be on us and our children, far from being an incitement to persecution, may have been Matthew's attempt to explain all of the bloodshed the Jewish people witnessed during the Roman siege of Jerusalem.
In the prophetic tradition, it was a judgment against those bearing authority in Israel, like many judgments that had gone before it.
And if that was the case, Sloyan goes on to quote Lloyd Gaston in saying,
very much against his own intention, he became one of the principal sources of the persecution of Israel, which has haunted the history of the Church down to our own day.
So, in Sloyan's opinion, not only was the passage a profession of innocence, it was an explanation of judgment. And why exactly had Jerusalem been judged? Oh, that's right, the city was responsible for the blood of the prophets, culminating with the blood of Jesus, as evidenced by their profession in Matthew 27:25.
Oh yeah? Well, we already knew from from the gospel accounts that members of the mob had used false witnesses against Christ and lied about his teachings.
Oh, that's so stupid it's hilarious. In reality, there's absolutely no evidence that members of the mob were in any way aware of false testimony about Jesus. In fact, as we explained in our trial series, the evidence indicates that the crowd was made up of recruited temple functionaries.
Let's take a trip down memory lane, shall we? My blame game video used the term mob to describe the whole people mentioned in Matthew 27:25. Namely, the religious leaders, the elders, the common folk, basically all of the Jewish elements gathered before Pilate demanding Jesus' death. I view them as a mob and describe them as such. Later, Holding responded to my video by insisting that the mob was boldly affirming their testimony as witnesses in a capital case. Now, I thought he couldn't be referring to everyone in the mob as witnesses. After all, it was the religious leaders who brought the charges before Pontius Pilate, not Joe the temple worker. So this is why at times in my follow-up video, I referred to members of the mob using false witnesses, or witnesses within the crowd. I was trying to make it clear that I only had certain people in view. Otherwise, I had a feeling Holding might try to accuse me of claiming every person in the mob had used false witnesses, which was certainly not my position. Now, I admit I use the terms mob and crowd interchangeably, even though the Gospels tend to refer to the word crowd as something distinct from the Jewish leaders. But I wasn't using those terms in any kind of rigid theological sense. But I think overall, Holding was somewhat justified in criticizing my word choice. I admit, if I was going to argue from the scriptures, I should have been more accurate with the terminology. So now that I've clarified how members of the mob was a reference to the religious leaders, I'll repeat my argument. According to the gospel writers, Jesus' accusers relied on false witnesses and they lied about his teachings in order to put him to death. Therefore, if the mob had boldly affirmed their testimony as witnesses, according to the principles later found in the Mishnah, then they condemned themselves with their own words, because Tractate Sanhedrin 37 placed blood guilt on any witness whose false testimony led to the death of an innocent person. And false testimony included hearsay as well as testimony from the mouth of another witness. Even if Holding could somehow prove that the whole people in verse 25 did not include any of the high priests, that would mean his crowd of temple functionaries condemned Jesus based on peer pressure from their employers. You know, the kind of testimony condemned by Sanhedrin 37. And yes, writers like Ian Wilson did suggest that the crowd was composed of temple employees loyal to the priests. However, Wilson also believed another possible explanation involved disillusioned, bitter ex-followers of Christ, although this view was based more on what the Gospels do not say than on what they do. However, it really wouldn't be all that surprising. In John 8, a crowd of Jews went from believing in Jesus in verse 31 to picking up stones in order to kill him by the time we reach verse 59. But forget ex-followers of Christ. Just imagine the excitement of the triumphal entry. And it wasn't an isolated event either. According to Matthew 21:10, the whole city was talking about it. Had the Son of David truly arrived? Would God finally deliver Israel from its enemies? And on top of that, Jesus' arrival coincided with the Passover festival, which celebrated God delivering his chosen people out of bondage in Egypt. Surely this was not a coincidence. For many in Jerusalem, it must have seemed as if the messianic age was at their very doorstep. And yet, within a week, the prophet from Nazareth was arrested, beaten, humiliated, and placed at the mercy of Rome. Frank Morrison is convinced that once Jerusalem's gates opened at sunrise, rumors of Jesus' arrest circulated quickly, and a steadily growing stream of curious people probably made their way to the upper city, although a wider realization of the arrest only happened later. But for those people who were aware of it, this was not the glorious outcome they had anticipated. How could this happen to God's anointed one? If Jesus was the Messiah, why didn't God come to his aid? The Son of David was supposed to destroy God's enemies, not become yet another prisoner. And what was that? He is guilty of blasphemy too? As hated as the chief priests were, on this issue, they were right. Jesus was no king. He was a false Messiah, and on top of that, a blasphemer. Under those circumstances, it's easy to imagine just how quickly some of the people in Jerusalem could have turned on Jesus. I think there's also a compelling theological reason the Gospel writers intended to show that the mob's composition grew to become more representative of Jerusalem. As David Garland explained, Matthew has shown Jesus' ministry to the Jewish people running full circle. He began his public ministry by healing the people end his public ministry by demanding his death. So, in my scenario, the assembly that transferred Jesus to Pilate in the early morning hours probably consisted of members of the Sanhedrin trial. But as time progressed, other elements were added, even temple functionaries, until by the time we reach Luke 23:13, Pilate has called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, a much more representative mob than the one initially assembled. Again, when I said members of the mob, I was talking about the priestly leadership, the same people who tried to use false testimony against Jesus during the Sanhedrin trial. I view the Jews in Matthew 27:25 collectively as a mob, whereas Holding does not, even though he considers the mob to be witnesses in a capital case. It's true that Luke 23 has the whole assembly making accusations against Jesus. However, Joel Green writes that the whole assembly which took Jesus before Pilate in Luke 23:1 consisted of the council of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law. No one else has been introduced into this stage of the hearing. In the next segment, Holding will even admit that it wasn't the mob of temple functionaries who handed Jesus over, but rather,
It was the chief priests and elders of the people, serving in their proper capacity under the Roman judicial system.
and I completely agree. If there were other people present when Jesus was handed over, I think they only repeated what they heard from the Jewish leaders.
Oh, come on. It also says the mob turned Jesus over out of envy.
Oh, where'd you get your scholarship from? An episode of Sesame Street? Now, yes, Matthew says it was out of envy that Jesus was handed over. But that wasn't the mob that did that. It was the chief priests and elders of the people, serving in their proper capacity under the Roman judicial system.
Despite what my doppelganger just claimed, I never said the mob turned Jesus over out of envy. I clearly stated Jesus' accusers did, and I gave Matthew 27:18 as my reference. And on top of that, Matthew 27:18 tells us Pilate was well aware of the fact that Jesus' accusers were motivated out of envy. Jesus' accusers were the chief priests and elders. I even focused on clips of the religious leaders at that point in the video. Well, from my point of view, it's just as bizarre to hear JP refer to temple functionaries as witnesses in a capital case. The religious authorities were the ones who accused Jesus before Pilate. They were the witnesses who served in their proper capacity as informants by testifying of his supposed crimes against the empire. If we look to Roman law, Adrian Sherwin White identifies the chief priests and elders as the delatores, or accusers of Jesus. The initial accusations would have been presented by no more than 2 or 3 spokesmen from the Sanhedrin's party. As we see in the Gospels, a charge was indicated, but not against a particular Roman law. It was against undesirable actions, like subverting the nation, and this was explained through accusations surrounding taxes and kingship. On the other hand, Holding's temple functionaries would have been part of what we today consider to be the gallery, and later they played their role well by screaming, "Crucify him, give us Barabbas," and basically piggybacking off of whatever their bosses said or did. So if the Jewish leaders were not a part of Holding's mob in Matthew 27:25, then how were temple functionaries considered witnesses? Not just bystanders who witnessed a trial, but actual witnesses who testified in a capital case.
Oh, yeah? Well, by that time, the trial was essentially over. Pilate had already heard all the witnesses.
Oh, there you go again. Now, as we explained in our series on the trial of Jesus, the whole point of Pilate bringing Jesus before the crowd was as an in-your-face to the high priest, which means in turn that Pilate was mockingly asking the crowd to offer their own judgment.
Yes, that is certainly Holding's point of view. I, however, hold to a more traditional understanding of the event, but I'll address that and so much more in my next video in the series. That's why I described it as Pilate's idea of justice. But the mob wasn't even willing to entertain that watered-down version. They wanted Jesus dead at any cost. And no, I'm not suggesting the profession would have had no meaning if it wasn't a formal trial. I just don't agree that the phrase would have had the meaning Holding attributed to it at that point in the trial if it was not formal. So, according to Holding, the formal trial was probably over. Pilate washed his hands of Jesus' blood, told the Jews to see to it yourselves, and in reply, a mob of temple functionaries decided to announce after the fact that their testimony had been truthful, even though their supposed testimony did not actually originate from them. They were just doing what their bosses told them to do. But it was truthful, somehow. Yeah. Now, from my point of view, Pilate washed his hands of Jesus' blood, told the Jews to see to it yourselves, and in reply, the mob of angry priests, elders, and Jerusalemites rose up with one voice and claimed responsibility for the blood of Jesus. The same responsibility Pilate had just given to them. And all of this was penned by Matthew in order to explain God's judgment upon the Jews during their war with Rome. Now that does make sense, especially in light of what Matthew had just written in chapters 23 and 24 about the impending judgment faced by the priests and the city of Jerusalem in that generation. No, see, I understand why an uproar in this situation would be expected. However, what I do not expect, and what I thought came across as silly, was Holding's insistence that a frenzied mob on the verge of rioting decided to make a statement that affirmed the potential impact of their testimony as leading to an execution. I think my take on Matthew 27:25 is more in tune with the mindset of an angry mob. One that was clearly out for blood and not the least bit concerned over assuring a Roman governor that their hearsay testimony was truthful.
Hey, look, I'm not saying the crowd knew Jesus was innocent. They knew he was guilty of blasphemy.
Didn't I tell you to watch my trial series and not make a fool of yourself? Oh, sure, the crowd probably did think Jesus was guilty of blasphemy. But as I pointed out, the actual charge attempted before Pilate was sedition against the Roman state.
Yet another straw man. I never said the charge before Pilate was blasphemy. At the 451 mark, I clearly stated when Jesus was taken to Pilate, he was accused of sedition. When they took Jesus to Pilate, they lied about his teaching on taxes and the nature of his kingdom in order to accuse him of sedition. However, I also recognized that passages like Matthew 26:66 showed the religious leaders were convinced Jesus deserved to die because he was guilty of blasphemy. But of course, the only way the Jews could accomplish that goal, at least legally, was through Pontius Pilate. As Holding said, the Romans could have cared less about blasphemy. So the religious leaders came up with a charge they believed would get the job done. For example, in Acts 18, the Jews made the mistake of bringing Paul before Governor Gallio, armed only with charges of alleged religious misconduct. The proconsul replied that he would have been willing to hear their case, but unfortunately their complaint was all about words and names involving the Jewish religion. Therefore, he had no interest in pressing charges. "Look to it yourselves," he said, almost parodying what Pilate commanded in Matthew 27:24. Look, I did not make the blasphemy statement in a vacuum. It was in response to Holding arguing that the mob wasn't
Speaking for the Jewish nation as a whole, or saying that they knew Jesus was innocent and that they accepted guilt for his death anyway.
I made it clear that was never my position. The fact is, the mob did not think Jesus was innocent. The Jewish trial conducted in Matthew 26 convinced the leaders that Jesus was guilty of blasphemy. So they and the rest of the people accepted responsibility for Jesus' blood in Matthew 27:25 because, in their minds, he had broken God's law and deserved to die. As long as the Romans were the public face of Jesus' execution, the whole people gathered before Pilate were willing to shoulder the responsibility for his death before God, because his punishment was justified. The sedition charge was a means to that end.
What difference does that all make? They were ignoring the prefect's judgment and twisting the Roman justice system.
Well, as I just said, the whole reason Pilate brought Jesus before the crowd was as an in-your-face to the high priest. So in reality, Pilate was taunting them and inviting them to challenge his judgment.
Yes, I know that's what Holding said, but again, I don't agree. We'll just have to wait until the next video in the series, though, to find out why. Prior to my October 20th video, I did watch Holding's entire trial series. At that time, I also read his online trial article, since it served as a foundation for the series. Fortunately, a local seminary stocked many of the sources Holding used in his article, so in the intervening months, I've taken the time to read the works of Sloyan, Morrison, Rivkin, as well as many others who have written about the trial of Jesus. So I definitely watched his trial series before I responded back in October.
Look, the bottom line is this. This passage played a major role in later Christian anti-Semitism. So thank God you and these scholars came to the rescue to tell us stupid people what Matthew really meant, right?
Exactly, you moron.
And as I said before, these scholars arrived on the scene after hundreds of years had passed and millions of Jewish lives had already been destroyed. Holding conveniently left that part out when he paraphrased me, and I can understand why. He's like a junior firefighter showing up for a 2-alarm blaze after a family has already perished in the flames, and then has the nerve to congratulate himself and his entire unit for courageously putting out the embers. But hey, that's Christianity for you. It has become a religion where the keys to understanding the kingdom are held not by fishermen, but by academia. If a Christian wants to study to show himself approved, as 2 Timothy instructs, he must first study material that is approved by people like Holding. Otherwise, they'll be spinning their theological wheels indefinitely. For example, when I told JP I was planning to address his video, he presented a list of 27 books dealing with the trial of Jesus, and he intimated that I had to read them first before I could adequately address his points. The thing is, I had already read 5 of those books prior to his post, as well as a few others that were not mentioned. Of course, Holding's response looked something like this. He continued to fling insults and flat out accused me of lying about having read any of the books in the first place. Always a class act. So that means not only has he made poor attempts at psychoanalyzing me in the past, but he's also a terrible mind reader. But who am I kidding? Of course it takes 27 books to fully grasp the trial narratives. After all, this is the same religion in which Christians pored over the scriptures for 1,500 years before some of them finally developed, or rediscovered, the doctrine of sola fide. So I guess it should come as no surprise that it took nearly 400 more years for textual criticism to develop, so that scholars could begin recognizing, hey, maybe the Jews aren't Christ killers after all. You could say better late than never, but that is of little comfort to the dead. So unfortunately, JP, not only have you been held in contempt, but your request for bail has been denied.
On. Cindy, the news is on. Another little white girl done fell down the well. 50 black people get their ass beat by police today, but the whole world gotta stop for one little whitey down the hall.